And so I felt like this morning, for this time period, I want to do something a little bit different for all of us, not just assembled here, but those who are joining us on streaming as well. And so I want to turn our attention to Hebrews chapter 6. I was thinking about this last night, and this passage just popped into my mind. And so let's read beginning in verse 13. For when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply you. And so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. For men indeed swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is for them an end of all dispute. Thus God, determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of the promise, the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath, that by two immutable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we might have a strong consolation who have fled for the refuge to lay hold of the hope set before us. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which enters the presence behind the veil. For the forerunner had entered for us, even Jesus, having become the high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. There's some things in this passage I hope that we'll take away as a matter of encouragement. Let me preface this. In Scripture, whenever there's a time of testing or adversity that is to come upon the people of God, a trial that takes place, not exclusive, but the majority of the time, it had to do with an outside element coming in. Most of the time, it had to do with the Judaizers coming in. Sometimes it had to do with rulers of the nation coming in. Sometimes it was the persecution against those who were Christians. And that test or adversity was there. And while we today live in the land of milk and honey, as Mark said in his prayer so eloquently, have an abundant living that we are provided today, that we don't face those kinds of things. We don't have, at this moment, some sort of government entity attacking us. We don't have Judaizing teachers come in and try to subvert the gospel. We're all very watchful of that. It's not just the shepherds here. We're all very watchful of that, mindful of that. But the challenges that we face, and for the most part, the challenges we have faced, but very few in the period of my history here, have been from the outside. And we're facing those things from the outside now. It's in the form of something called a virus. And it's in the form of a health struggle called a stroke. And so while that adversity that's facing us is different than someone persecuting us, it still is something that's affecting this church profoundly. I mean, it's such a blessing to see Cal here this morning. When I saw Cal, I was amazed. What are you doing here? You just got out of the hospital. You know, I think one day they may be able to put all the stents that Cal has on eBay and pay for all the surgeries. I don't know that they thought they could put any more stents in. But we're thankful that he's here. And so we see these health challenges that come. So when I think about that, I think about, okay, where do we need to go to remind us that, as Terry said, God is still in control and God's on his throne? And this passage helps me, and I hope some things I observe from this help you this morning. First of all, it says, for when God made a promise, how do we know when God makes a promise, He's going to keep His promise. You know, I can promise Kevin something, and all good conscience mean to keep it. But perhaps I forget what I've promised. Perhaps the circumstance changes, or perhaps I just renege on the promise. But when Kevin and I have that agreement, I make that promise, there's an expectation on his part that I'm going to fulfill what I've promised to him. That's the agreement with men. That's what we understand that takes place among us, and that's what the Hebrew writer says. He says, we understand how that works among us. But how many times are promises made, and either malignantly or innocently, those promises are broken? So how do we know God is going to keep His promise? Well, the Hebrew writer tells us two things here. First of all, he says that by two immutable things, which it is impossible for God to lie. When God makes a promise, God cannot lie. We make the statement that there's nothing God can't do. Yes, there is. God can't lie. It is incompatible, completely incongruous with His character and His nature. It is as impossible for God to lie as it is for me and you to sprout wings and fly this very moment. God can't lie. And furthermore, the second immutable thing is that when God swore an oath, He could swear by no one greater than Himself. You know, I may go to a court of law. Like a few weeks ago, Judy and I were challenged. She got picked, I didn't, to go to a jury. And you have to swear or affirm that you will fulfill an oath. The President of the United States puts his hand on a Bible and says he will faithfully execute the Constitution of the United States. We understand when we put our hand there and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, that we put our hand there and say we'll defend the Constitution, that we are making an oath before God. We are committing our word to Him. But before whom is He going to make an oath? It's not going to be me and you. He's not going to put His Bible and say, I swear by Rickie. That's not going to happen. He can swear by no one greater than Himself. And because there's no one greater than He is sovereign. When He swore by Himself and that He cannot lie, when God said it, that promise is going to come true. It's not going to change. And so He says, when God made a promise to Abraham, well, what promise did He make to Abraham? He made a promise to Abraham that, number one, his name would be great, and through his seed many nations would be blessed. And we see throughout biblical history how that God kept that promise. And sometimes there were some ups and sometimes there were some downs. How in the world does God fulfill the promise to Abraham to get the children of Israel into Egypt? Because He said they're going to go into a strange land in Genesis 15, 13, and 14, and they're going to be there 430 years. How in the world does He do that? He does it from a younger brother that was picked on by his older brothers. In fact, they despised him so much they sold him into slavery. And lo and behold, he was such a unique character as a young man growing into his own maturity that he rose to be second in the land of Egypt, and he called for his brothers and his fathers to come, and now then the children of Israel are in Egypt under beneficent Pharaoh. And as long as Joseph is there and that beneficent Pharaoh is there, the children of Israel, they're fine. But now then that Pharaoh dies and Joseph dies and a tyrant comes. Well, it looks like the children of Israel are going to go by the way. No, they increase. In fact, it's interesting. In times of adversity, the people of God have not decreased, they've increased. Why is that? Because we understand what it is to buckle down with one another. We understand what it is to have, as my son used to say, each other's back. I stand for you, you stand for me. We stand together as one in this. And that's how God fulfilled His promise to Abraham, and through that, His seed, the Christ, would come. And by the way, was his path a bowl full of cherries? It had some pits along the way too, didn't it? It wasn't all roses without thorns. In fact, he bore a crown of thorns. And God's promise to us came through a cross, through adversity. And sure enough, as he said to Abraham, your children will be so many, you can't number the sands of the seashore. And if you tried to count the children of God throughout history, not just present, but throughout history, we couldn't number them all. God kept his promise to Abraham. That does something for me and you. That says that when God keeps a promise, we've seen he'll keep that promise. So verse 14 says, saying, surely I will bless you and I'll multiply you. And after that he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. After he patiently endured, now we come to Abraham. How did Abraham make it? He patiently endured. I don't know when, I don't know how, I don't know where. But I know this. The pages of history are going to be written one day. And COVID/Delta strain and whatever comes forward will be an asterisk of time in the history of men. As you know, I've told you before, my older sister was stricken with polio at 8 months old. She walks today with a pronounced limp and suffers the ravages of what that is. But when's the last time we heard of someone being stricken with polio? Because of Dr. Jonas Salk medical discovery. Smallpox used to be a miserable way to die. But it's just an asterisk on the history of man and time. But that asterisk will be in time. That's not now. And I don't know when, I don't know how, I don't know where, but one day someone's going to find the key to unlock the cure for diabetes. And all of our pump-wearing people will be able to throw those pumps away. And one day, there's going to be a cure for cancer. Don't know when, don't know where, don't know why. But one day there is. And when that takes place, that asterisk will be put there. But that asterisk is not today. That means today, then, that diabetes and cancer and this COVID and Delta strain, they're serious for us. Just at the count, and this is not the ones that are on the back of the personal, because there were some that did not want to be mentioned, and that's fine. Approximately 25, I think, that we have in this number. If the number were really revealed, I think we might have a third of this church right now that's being affected. How are we going to make it? We're going to patiently endure. That's what we're going to do. We're not going to give up, folks. My good folks streaming with us, those that are hurting now, we're not going to give up. We're not going to give up on you. We're not going to give up on another, and we're not going to give up on God. We're not going to give up doing what we know is right to do. We're going to do what is right to do because it's right to do, and we're going to serve one another. And we're going to be of one heart, one soul, and one mind with one another. Because when God's people hurt, God's people circle the wagons. And we have people in our church that are hurting, and some of us can reach out and we can help with that. And we can help those who are hurting, or those who are challenged, or those who are threatened because of existing health conditions. We can help them patiently endure. We who are healthy are going to be there to help the best we can to carry those and serve those and administer to those who cannot do that for themselves now. And in that, we are going to patiently endure. And we're going to make it through because we have a faith and a confidence in a God who promised something. And He cannot lie. Now let me add this codicil. If God forbid, on this side of eternity, we should lose someone, that's our loss, not theirs. They have a hope. And that's what he further says. He says that by two immutable things in which it's impossible for God to lie, we have a strong consolation. Who have fled refuge, lay hold of the hope that is set before us, this hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast. Notice, because God cannot lie and He swore by Himself, He says, we have a strong consolation. We who have fled for refuge, to lay hold of the hope set before us. We can enjoy this life, and there's a lot to enjoy about this life. God has blessed us richly, as I said a moment ago, in the United States of America, to live in the land of milk and honey. And in my beloved state of Texas, we have a prosperity much of the nation doesn't experience. And we're thankful for that. But this is not where it's at. I'm not anxious to preach another funeral. Please don't get me wrong here. But this is not where it's at. It really is not about my health. And it's really not about our numbers in attendance. This life is not where it's at. It's this life that is going to enable us to have the hope of eternity with God. Because it's now that we, like Abraham, patiently endure with a faith that's unwavering. Are you impressed with that statement in Genesis chapter 22? He says of Abraham, now I know. And I think what he's saying is, now, Abraham, now you've experienced this. You have a faith that has now been demonstrated. And we have an opportunity now. Every one of us. We have an opportunity to demonstrate a faith that will be unwavering. God's not asking us to raise the knife, to slay our son. But we can have a faith that is strong and unwavering, that is lay hold of a strong consolation. To lay hold of a hope that is set before us. And that's a refuge for us. What's a refuge? A refuge is a place you go to find protection, relief, respite, a break. And what he says is, we are safe in the arms of Jesus. We're under the cleft of the rock, and that rock is Jesus. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 4, that traveled with the children of Israel throughout the whole time of their wilderness. Jesus was with them, feeding them and giving them water. And that's the cleft that we hide under. He's our refuge. That's why we can come today like this, because of what He's provided for us in the cross. And we can look at one another, and we can see one another, whether present or on stream. We can see each other, and we can know when we look at each other, there's hope for us. The very fact that God's people today, the Lord's Day, across this nation, across this world, for every time it's the first day of the week, are assembled in places similar to this. Maybe not a nice building like this, but they're assembled together just as we are assembled together, is a refuge. And what we're doing here today is something that is a refuge for us. It's a respite to come and say, let the world be laid aside now. We've got a dearest sister in a hospital bed with a stroke. We don't know what's the outcome is going to be. We have people, dear sister and dear brother, in a hospital bed because of pneumonia and infection of COVID. And we have people in beds because of infections. But listen, none of those things change our hope. And for those that are grasping, you've laid hold of something. And that's a strong consolation for us. And we who are healthy need to understand that too. We need to understand that strong consolation, that hope that's there. Now, notice what he says. This anchor of the soul is sure and steadfast. You can count on it. You can put a peg there. See, y'all didn't know the Holy Spirit and I were talking together here. His sure and steadfast is my peg. I borrowed that from him, you see. That peg is an authorized statement, yeah. He said, you can put a peg here. You can count on this. It's sure and steadfast. I'm not going to relent, and we're not going to give up our faith. We're not going to yield our hope. We're not going to yield our hope to the adversary when he frontally attacks us. We're not going to yield our hope to the adversary when he attacks us from the backside or from the side. We're not going to yield our hope to an adversary when he tries to assault us with something that's beyond our control. We have a hope that is steadfast and sure, and it's anchored. Notice, it's anchored in one who entered the presence behind the veil, that is Jesus Christ, who's our high priest. Do we realize the value of having Christ as our high priest? He didn't have to cleanse himself like Aaron and the others did before he goes in. He is a perfect high priest. And that means as a perfect high priest, he's offering perfect sacrifices, which is himself. And that means that when we approach the throne of God, we have a perfect high priest that lays it before the throne of God as we would if we could. What do we say in prayer now? How do we word that? How do we have the words? I just know this. We have an intercessor. And that intercessor, when he intercedes and lays our prayers before the throne of God, lays them there as we would if we could, because we have a high priest that has entered the veil and does that for us. And so we pray to God. We may feel inadequate on this side. We may feel like we don't know what to say, but listen. If I may term it this way, when God opens the email and the intercessor has transcribed that email, it's just as we would if we could. And we have a hope of salvation because why? Because we have a perfect high priest who offers the sacrifice for us. There's a blood sacrifice that cleanses us, that COVID can't take and a stroke can't take. Nothing will defeat the blood of Christ. And because we have that sacrifice, we have an assurance. And so as I bring this down this morning, let me back up and review. We have a promise, but we must endure. And that promise is based in two things. God can't lie, and he swore by himself. And we have a promise that's based in a hope that's anchored in a high priest that's entered for us and offers sacrifice and makes intercession for us. So when I think about this passage, I think about where we're at today as a church today. And this is today. And when I think about all our good folks that are streaming with us and that are holding on or that are struggling, remember who God is. Remember the promise. But remember, we're going to have to endure. But remember, it's a promise based on a God who will not lie. And remember, we've laid hold of a hope that's sure and steadfast. And remember, there's a high priest that offers himself for us that nobody, no thing can triumph. So, while it seems today we feel a little defeated, please keep it in perspective of the overall picture of God's time. It's just today. But even if it's just today, today's not where it's at. Today's important because it prepares us for tomorrow. We love you. We're praying for you. To all of our folks that are streaming with us, God bless you. And we thank God for you. You're a wonderful group of God's people. And we are going to overcome. We're not going to quit. And we're not going to be defeated. Terry's going to lead us in a couple of verses of song, and then we'll have a closing prayer and be dismissed to our classes. Thanks, folks. Good to see you.